Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. Best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. February is Black History Month, and as we close out the month, I thought we'd do a throwback episode, this time with Dr. Darron Smith from the University of Memphis. We're going to talk about his book, Race, Religion, and Sport. This deals with BYU athletes and how, especially non-LDS Black athletes, have been dealt with over the years. So Darron will talk about how BYU can do better. We'll also talk about different forms of racism. You know, this is kind of a throwback episode. It's funny how some of the things have changed. At the time, college players were not paid, and now with the NIL, that's happening. So Darron actually got his wish there. Also, the Washington Redskins are now the Washington Commanders. The Cleveland Indians are now the Cleveland Guardians. So Darron got a couple of other wishes there, although the Atlanta Braves are still the Atlanta Braves. So, and the Kansas City Chiefs are still the Kansas City Chiefs too. So anyway, check out our conversation, and just remember, this is a full episode from 2017. So welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Darron Smith. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Memphis. Is that right?
That's correct.
So just wanted to introduce you to my audience that are going to be watching this later. Tell us a little bit about your background and especially your academic history.
Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I teach at the University of Memphis. I think you mentioned that earlier, Rick, but I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee. It's where I claim home, I guess. Well, I guess home is in between California and Nashville. I was born in Nashville, and we moved to California, came back to Nashville when I was a youth, and graduated from high school, joined the Mormon church there, went on a mission, came back, then ended up at Ricks College, University of Utah, BYU, then back to Utah. So I've been in Utah I lived in Utah for over 20 years before I moved, after I finished my degree, my PhD, then I moved from here to Wichita, Kansas, and worked there for a few years, and then on to Memphis, where I am now. So, so it's been a long run, man. It's been a long run.
So, from what I understand, you were a physician's assistant. Is that is that at the University of Utah?
Yes. Well, I graduated from Utah in '96 with my PA certificate then, and I've been practicing as a PA ever since. I mean, I've kind of on and off sometimes, but I've been maintaining my practice just to keep my skills up. So I taught at PA schools. When I left here, I went to a PA school, the University of Wichita State in Wichita, Kansas, and I went on to open up the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center new PA program in Memphis, and so that's why I moved to Memphis. But anyway, so yeah, those are the things that took me out. So now I'm in sociology, where I should have been all along. So I'm much better suited for sociology, I believe.
Okay, so you got your PhD in sociology?
Yeah, well, it was in the Department of Behavioral Science, and the Department of Health, or Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah. And it's more of a interdisciplinary degree. So my focus area was in sociology. So then I took, when I was at the University of, when I was at BYU, I got my minor in sociology. So, and I've been teaching all of my courses in sociology. So all my research is in sociology. So I pretty much, I'm a sociologist or behavioral scientist, if you will. So.
Well, great. I'm excited. I met you about a month ago.
Yeah.
You got
where did we meet? Where did you?
Was it the King's English bookstore?
That's right. You came out to that. That's right. Thank you for coming.
So tell us about your book. What's the name of your book, and tell us what it's about?
It's called When Race, Religion, and Sport Collide: Black athletes at BYU and Beyond. It was published by Rowman & Littlefield in 2016, toward the end of the year, so around November-ish. So published first on hardback, then later came out on paperback. So that's a testament to how well it's doing. So I'm really glad to see, because most books like this don't really do well, but sports books, actually, there's a market for sports books. So viewers, if you're listening to us, there is a market for sports books, particularly when you mix it with religion, which is a very interesting mix, which is what the book is really about. I'm trying to talk about, and as you mentioned earlier, Rick, I'm trying to look at sports as an industrial complex, the thorny topic of race, and how religion sort of underscores it all. And I'm using BYU as a lens, because I worked there for several years, and I saw and met and just was witness to several incidences, high profile incidences, where athletes they came in and they were there for a short time and they were out. And generally when they left, it was too much fanfare and media attention, public scrutiny, if you will. And I noticed a pattern of just those young men who seem to have their business trotted out in the public versus other athletes who you never hear anything about. So that really got me thinking about it. And then, of course, the Brandon Davies thing happened in 2011. You probably remember that. And that really tipped the scale for me. I was like, there's a story here, And so then I was worked with a gentleman named Luke O'Brien, who was working for a media outlet called Deadspin in 2011. And so he and I collaborated on an article about this phenomena of high-profile athletes being kicked out of BYU, and that led to the book When Race, Religion, and Sport Collide. So I did a much more expansive look at that. So,
yeah. So I bought it last month. I read the whole thing. It's a great book.
Thank you.
So I really encourage everyone to check it out. So one of the things, we live here in Utah. We're just down the road, literally from BYU right now, here in Orem, and so I wanted to talk a little bit because I think a lot of listeners probably think that a lot of Black athletes are held up as role models and that sort of thing. One of the things in your book, you said that Blacks were kicked out at a higher rate than white students. So I kind of have a statistics background. So give us some of the statistics about that kind of support that.
Yeah, well, the accounts of high terminations were looked at based on public media accounts with media outlets and their stories that they covered, police record reports, court records. So went back and tried it over a 20-year period to find all of that data to verify the findings. And so when I looked at my data that I found for that time period based upon the athletes that were kicked out, the two matched. I mean, so I was just a simple tally. It wasn't a whole lot of fancy mathematics. It was just a simple tally. You look at what you have, look at what you have, and they overlay. So, a tally can be as scientific as anything. So, this is not fake news or alternative truth. The information that's contained in the book is based on public record. So I tried to find and verify all of the data. And if I couldn't verify it in the literature, I would actually interview the athlete to get their particular side of it. So it was a mixed methods book, if you will, but much more of a simple tally.
Yeah. So let's talk about what percent of students are, I don't know if we should go with just Black or all racial minorities, if you want to lump those together, compared to white students at BYU. Let's start with just simple as that.
I don't recall the figures. It's actually in the book, but the numbers are very, very small. I mean, in comparison to, like, for instance, black folks at BYU, I think it's less than 1% of the student body at BYU is Black. That's around 200 or 300 Black students on a campus. That's at least. Yeah. So you have very, very low numbers, and most of the Blacks, and I'm not saying that's bad. I don't want to, this is a good or bad thing. We have to get out of that narrative and think about this much more critically, think about this it's a much more complicated story than just a good and bad narrative. So I want to be clear with that. And this is not also a slam on the church. I want to be clear about that too. This is not I'm not hating on the church. I want to make sure that people know that this is a scholarly exercise for me. I happen to be a member of the church. This is very interesting to me to want to know, how we treat other people who are not of our faith, who are not the same religion, who are not the same race, and have the same background, class-oriented background, because most of these young men come from urban America. They come from inner city communities where most of them, at least the ones that I interviewed for this particular book, and then the article that Luke and I did, come from broken homes. Very few of these men had fathers in their midst, or they had mothers who were working very hard to make sure they had an opportunity. And so they were, like most parents, most Black parents in any across the country, who want their children to have a better opportunity than they had. If they have skills that they can harness for that, such as their athletic ability, and then BYU has a good reputation as being a Christian institution, why not go there? So, and the young men, when they come here, to BYU's credit, I think they, people here are nice, man. I mean, I'm in Utah, viewers, if you don't realize that. I think Rick mentioned we're in Orem, so we're in Utah, but people here are nice. I mean, when I lived here for many years, I mean, one of the things I can say is that, Utah is you'll find some of the nicest racists you'll ever see in the country right here in Utah. Very nice people who don't, who don't, at least when I was here, never came up to me or called me out my name or, made me feel, less than here. And I think it's just the isolation of being Black in a white environment where there's very little cultural things that you like, people who look like you, vibe like you, have the same sort of ideas and about life and the world as you do. So that was sort of my one of the reasons why I left. But getting back to the story with these young men, so with the tally and with the looking at these athletes and over the 20-year span, again, remember Luke and I did a very small percentage of them then, and we found the same thing. So I went a little further and found the same thing. So in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, if you go back and look at the Deadspin piece, read that, and you'll see some of the similarities in terms of how we did the same sort of methodology with this one. It was a very simple methodology. Having said that, they come from urban America. They come here and they expect to be treated like most athletes across the country decently, to be given an opportunity to have at an education, which many of them don't get. Many of these young men, they get here, they're not prepared to be here. Let's just be straight up, not through no fault of their own, but through the circumstances of race and living in a society that doesn't value education, much public education at least, and of course the education of Black children. So you have all of these things working to the detriment of young men who are accepted to BYU and other predominantly white campuses at a much higher rate than non-athletes, right? So if I went to a shitty school, pardon my language, I'm not sure what kind of listeners we have here, a terrible school that didn't have all the same academic preparation that the school across the tracks had, I'm coming to this institution with a deficit. I don't have the same ability to argue, to think critically, to read critically, to comprehend what I'm reading. So a lot of these young men that I personally knew when they're at BYU, but also teaching at Memphis, I teach student athletes as well, and I see many of the same struggles. These young folks are using their athletic ability to get themselves out of their circumstances, them and their families out of circumstances of being Black, living in poverty, and having to live in circumstances that many of us, wish we wouldn't, wish others, at least I hope, wouldn't have to go through. I think their experiences speak to the gross degree of inequality that exists within our country, economically, but also racially and otherwise. And so this is a result, the proliferation of Black athletes in college into Division I college sports, and not just Division I, Division II, Division III, all throughout Division I athletics, is a result of the failure of American public schools to truly educate Blacks on their own terms. Right. And to give them access to what whites take for granted is a decent education. Right. So why we see these young men and why we like to see them play, and we get excited when we see Black athletes play, because they bring a style of play into competition that whites don't bring generally. And if whites do bring it, they've gotten it from Blacks. They're imitating Blacks. And this style of play is deeply embedded within the experiences of these young men growing up in the communities that they grew up in. Right. Where they had to be cool to survive. Right. So whereas the trumpeter plays the horn to be cool, these young men use their bodies to be cool. They use their swagger to be cool, their athleticism to be cool. Right. That's how they get through life. That's how they cope with the realities of living in the circumstances that they do. So, and I see it when I teach these young men, when I have to grade them and evaluate their work, I see it. And I saw it when I was teaching at BYU, and it was sadly reproduced year after year after year with each incoming class at BYU, because I feel that with such a high degree of expulsions, Rick, it would stand to reason then that maybe the institution is failing to educate these men and their families prior to coming here of the high degree or the high probability that they may not succeed, right? I understand, and some of the listeners may say, well, but it's an educational institution, it's not a business. Well, it is a business. Sports is a business. And that's what we need to look at it as. And the reason why I'm saying this is that think about the sort of appellation the word we use, student athlete, and what that means, right? These, at least Black students who are athletes on these campuses, white campuses, are more athlete than they are student. They're more of a workforce than they are a traditional student, because they have all of the trappings of a worker. They work between 50 and 55 hours a week. Most of it's devoted to football, either football or non-football related activities. 20 hours a week. The NCAA says you have to have 20 hours a week devoted to your sport, but they don't say anything about non-hours devoted to your sport. So these young men spend a lot of time on football related things, which takes them out of the classroom that they're not prepared to be in to begin with, which throws them behind when they have to do their homework, when they have to actually do a test, actually learn something. And so they're not there to get an education. They're there to play football. They have 4 years of eligibility to play. And when they get done with that, they're gone, if they even finish within the 4 years. And the data tells us that the federal government keeps graduation data from over a 6-year period. So if you started school this fall, 2017 in the fall, that would follow you for 6 years. That cohort of thousands of students all across the country would follow that cohort for 6 years. And you can see within that 6-year period at each institution, the percentages of students that actually complete within that 6-year period and those that don't. The number of Black students that complete within the 6-year period at each institution is determined by a lot of factors. But for student athletes, the percentages are very low, and it depends on where you go. For instance, in Tennessee, where I live, Vanderbilt has a very high GSR score, right? The graduation student record. So basically, when the student graduates from college, the university guarantees the student will graduate within a 6-year period after they finish their years of eligibility. In this situation, the students there have a much higher GSR. They finish, they graduate, because that's the mission of Vanderbilt is education, not football. That's why they don't do very well. Occasionally, they'll do okay in basketball. Occasionally, and then you have a fluke year where they'll have a decent team. But generally, Vanderbilt, when I was there in Nashville as a youth, never did well because that wasn't their mission. Their mission was education. You see the same thing at other elite private schools where their mission is education. Like Duke. Duke has a decent GSR score. It's a private school, one of the best basketball teams, Division I teams in the country, one of the best programs in the country. They have a decent GSR score because their mission is to graduate students. So it depends on the institution. But in general, Black athletes at Division I schools, the big divisions, I'm not talking about the small divisions, but the bigger division schools, the high revenue sport generating schools, like the tournament we see going on right now with the Final Four coming up soon. You see those schools really get the bulk of the dollars that flow into college athletics vis-a-vis the students that they bring in. Look at the college teams, Rick. Look at the tournament, man. Look at how many Black players are in the tournament compared to white players. It's overwhelmingly Black. Look at UNC, damn near all Black. So that's the way it's been for decades in this country. And I don't see it changing because Black athletes, student athletes, are exactly that. They are athletes first, students second, and they're workers first, students second. They're not there to get an education. So let's quit that fallacy. So this brings me to the point with BYU. How much time do I got left?
No, you got plenty of time.
Okay.
You're going to be here a while.
Yeah. Here's the thing with BYU. Because of BYU's mission, because of what it professes to be, and for the listeners, you know what I'm talking about. For those who are members of the church, you know what I'm talking about. The mission of saving souls. It would seem to me that would supersede the business of sport, even at BYU. But what we see there is what we see at all PWIs, predominantly white institutions, is the same business plan and the same ways of generating resources and revenue that we see elsewhere. We see no hint of gospelism there. We see no hint of helping these young men, recognizing I've got great colleagues still at BYU that work there who've done good studies looking at urban America, looking at Blacks in America, from various vantage points. We know where most of these young people come from. We know that. So wouldn't it then behoove us to be better than the next guy, the next gal? You know what I'm saying?
So that brings up another point, because one of the points you made in your book that I wanted to talk about was, especially with the Black athletes, because typically a lot of them are not LDS and the honor code. So in your book, you mentioned that the honor code is kind of downplayed, and then it almost feels like it's sprung on these guys.
Yeah.
And the one thing that some of the Black athletes at BYU have said, that shouldn't they be more lenient instead of less? But on the other hand, they're the ones with the higher expulsion rate.
Right.
And do you remember what that rate was white students compared to black students at BYU?
I don't
think it was as
remember.
high as 77.
It was high.
Yeah.
It was pretty high. So it's pretty high. But there's a reason for that, though. I think and it goes back to what you were saying before. It goes back to the fact that these young men are not Mormon. They don't have they don't know the rules. They don't understand the rules. They don't understand that the honor code is not just a code. It's theology. It's Mormon theology in a code, right? It's what the honor code for Mormon students is kind of like, I do it already. I mean, it's not like, you know what I'm saying? They don't have to think about that. Most Mormon students don't, but black students, they don't have that. They already come primed. By the time they get here, I would imagine most of them have had sexual encounters by the time they get here. By the time they get here, I would imagine most of them have drank. They probably smoked. They probably done a lot of things that they wouldn't do here, that they wouldn't have access to here. And then they lived a life that is significant or synonymous with someone who lives in poverty or someone who lives in a low income community. That's their worldview. And you bring them there and you bring them to the most isolated place. There's other isolated places. There's Connecticut, there's Maine, but it's different. The whole state isn't wrapped around religion as swirling as an ideology beneath the chaos. They don't have to worry about that, but here they have to deal with that. And that's the unfairness of it all. To BYU's credit, I did say, they have made some attempts to ameliorate some of the suffering that some of these young people, and they're 18 years old, Rick. Come on now. They're kids. Their brains are not even fully developed yet until they're 25, 26 years old, depending on their gender. They're still developing, young people. They're going to make stupid mistakes, especially those who grew up in circumstances, not of their own making. Those individuals probably have a higher percentage of ADD, ADHD, probably oppositional defiant disorder, probably some conduct disorder thrown in there as well, probably some depression, some things, that speaks to their experience, the trauma of living the way that they had to live, and why football and basketball is so important to these young people. When you have young people, man, young African Americans who believe the rhetoric about what football and basketball can do for them, you have a problem, right? They've bought into the very same system that's oppressing them, and they don't even have any cognizance of it, which is deeply troubling. Again, it speaks to the deplorable schools that we have in this country.
So let's talk about it. So you mentioned in your book that if it's a white player, especially a white Mormon player, one of the things they can do with the honor code is they can go to their bishop. Now, if we got either a non-LDS, we can even talk about Jim McMahon. He's a white non-LDS player.
Yeah.
Boy, I've heard a lot of stories.
Yes, indeed.
BYU.
Yes, indeed.
Especially under LaVelle Edwards, they looked the other way on a lot of stuff with him.
I tried to find Jim McMahon. I looked high and low to find him. Yeah, I knew I located him to that, but beyond that, I couldn't go any further. I was trying to. I would love to talk to him about. Tell me about this.
Well, and I think in your book you mentioned one of the things that he said was you need to get a girl that'll keep your mouth shut.
That's right. Yes, he did say that.
So, but what are some things that BYU could do, especially with a non-Mormon athlete? They're not going to have a bishop. Would it be a good idea for them to get maybe another denominational leader to counsel them to go through this same process that LDS athletes would go through?
It's a fantastic idea. That's a fantastic idea. Having an outside party do it. Right now, they have a gentleman on campus that's doing it. So he's sort of the liaison. His name is Jim Slaughter. Jim's a great guy. So I know Jim personally. He's a great guy, a good guy. He gets it, right? But so much, his hands are tied much of the time in terms of what he really can do to help. And I'm not necessarily sure if Jim is the right person for it, simply because he doesn't necessarily relate to these young men. I take nothing away from Jim, but in terms of his ability to relate to these young men and their experiences, probably not. And I think Jim would be honest enough to say, yes, you're probably right, Darron. So I think your suggestion is fantastic. There's France Davis in Salt Lake. There's, France is tied in with a lot of different, Pastor Davis is tied in with a lot of different communities. He could even probably dispatch someone to Provo if need be, to serve as a sort of an ombudsman for these young men and players if they, sort of run afoul of the honor code system. So these are things that should have been thought of before they came here, right? Before these young men came here.
And on the other hand, it seems like, well, you don't have a bishop, so there's no
recourse.
So
Right. Exactly. Whereas the white athlete, and it makes sense, it makes sense. The white athlete has the repentance process that they can initiate, right? Almost immediately. And whereas the African-American player who's non-Mormon, they don't have that same luxury. So for them, it's a much more harsher, reprisal from the institution because they have none of those systems in place. So that's why we see the disparities between blacks and whites and actually Polynesians within. And Polynesians it's a mixed bag with Polynesians. And it's a mixed bag with Mormons who are African Americans, who are Mormons, or who are biracial blacks, biracial Mormons. There's differences too in terms of how justice is meted out with them as well by church leaders. So it depends. It totally depends. But I say it depends until you look at the data. When you look at the data, then you say, wait a minute, there's a pattern there.
Well, let's look at the data. Do you have some numbers that you remember?
You have the book? We got the book. We can sort of, let's check it out. In regards to the data we were discussing earlier. So if you look at Black male student athletes, constituted 60% of all disciplined athletes over a 25-year period from 1991 to 2015, whereas only 20% of white males. And yet blacks only made up 9% of student athletes at BYU, right? So even more alarming was the rate of black dismissals, right? Expulsions. So black males were removed at a rate of nearly 80%, while white male dismissals were made up only 10%. I mean, I don't see that as surprising at all. I mean, really, it shouldn't be surprising that much because, let me see what it says here. Let's see. So as of the fall of 2013, BYU reported 4,139 students of color on campus. Underrepresented minority students as a whole just made up 14% of the student body. Most of them were Asian Pacific Islanders. Okay, that shouldn't surprise anybody. That's why BYU made the decision to go with the coach they have now, because they're catering to this pot, which they should.
Economic shiitake you're talking about.
They should. That was a great decision. So I would celebrate that decision. And I think they'll have a better result because of the coach that they have. So I hope this coach is not a puppet, though. This coach has his own mind. He can think, but that's a good decision. So I celebrate that decision. Okay, so let me see. They made up 40% of student bodies. So less than 1% so black people made up 265 students for that year, which was less than 1% of total student body. So it's that's not BYU's fault. It's not their fault that they have such a low population of students.
Or is it? You mentioned something about Harold B. Lee back in the 70s. Well, can you talk about that statement?
Right. Well, is this the one with my granddaughter said don't marry? Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is this: I'm speaking in modern times. The low numbers of black students on campus today who are non-Mormon students, right? BYU has no control over that in terms of who applies here. They have people that go out and try to recruit people, but ultimately students can make their own decisions and go where they go. So people go where they want to go. But I think that in terms of, sorry, I thought that was a piece of hair, man, my bad.
No problem.
I lost my train of thought now.
You're talking about black students. There are not a lot of them at BYU.
There's not a lot because the church doesn't really, the proselytizing amongst blacks has not been as successful as maybe some folks would have hoped. But what do you expect with such a history? I mean,
so let me just mention one thing. So there's a current BYU coach. I'll keep this a little bit vague, but I'm sure if you're a sports fan, you can figure out who I'm talking about. But he used to coach at the University of Utah. I had a conversation with him, and I remember specifically he pointed at a black athlete and he said, We really recruited that athlete well. We brought the parents out and let them see the campus. He said, when I was at the University of Utah, it was much easier to recruit Black athletes at Utah than it is at BYU. And I was surprised, number one, that he was so open about that. But number two, he just talked about how much harder it is to recruit the Black athlete at BYU. And why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, as I say in the book, Rick, I mean, it's the culture of Provo. It's just Provo. It's the bubble. It's the consciousness of Mormons in this community. It's the lack of lack of knowledge of Black people, even in 2017. It's the isolation here. It's a sense of isolation. You have to really, to fit in here, you have to have if you're non-Mormon and you're Black and you're Mormon, fitting in is another story of itself. But if you're not Black and non-Mormon, it's very hard here. I mean, there's nothing to do here, really. There's no, things for young people to do other than, you think, well, this is a college campus. Well, yeah, but in terms of in the community itself, there's nothing really, everything revolves around BYU. So either you participate at BYU or you don't. And most football players hang together. They hang together because they're isolated. The football, the athletic department, just the nature of the athletic department isolates student athletes. They just isolate it. And you can really see that with BYU. And again, other schools, you have the same complaint with students of color who go to predominantly white schools. This is a phenomenon that's across PWIs, not just BYU, but across campuses, predominantly white campuses. It's hard, man, very hard. And students don't do well, because they're dealing with, remember, these are young people who are coming from communities that none of us have I do. Most white people have no clue about the difficulties of living in urban America, right? They have no idea. And you're traumatized, man. There's traumas there.
So let me ask you a question. There's been a lot of high-profile athletes in the news, so I want to get your opinion a little bit on this. So let's take somebody like Randy Moss. Randy Moss, one of the greatest wide receivers in the NFL. He was a very troubled high school student. He first, I believe, was originally recruited by Notre Dame. He had some trouble with the law. Notre Dame left him. Then he was going to go to Florida State. There was a little bit of an uproar saying this Randy Moss is not a good character. So he didn't go to Florida State. He ended up going to a place called Marshall University, which is, I believe it's a historically black college. Did really well, got drafted by the Minnesota Vikings. Even at Minnesota, he had an incident where he bumped a person with a car or something. So so the question is, we've also got a player, Mixon, University of Oklahoma right now, punched a woman, broke her jaw. The coach let it go, but the video just came out about a year after the incident, and now, black player, and now he's declared for the NFL because Oklahoma won't have him anymore. So my question to you, because it's not just BYU that has these problems. This is Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Florida State. There's a lot of places. Even Johnny Manziel, a white player for Texas A&M, had a lot of issues. So the question is it appropriate for a university to be recruiting these kinds of players for their football ability and not for their academic? I mean, if they're a student athlete, is there some hypocrisy going in recruiting these kinds of players who really don't belong in college?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at them as a workforce, that would justify, recruiting. I mean, you can and of course use the euphemism student athlete as a way to kind of get around the fact that they're workers. So we know this stuff. The data on these kids, we have lots of data on these kids, where they come from, the struggles they've had. The traumas that they carry. You mentioned Manziel, and you mentioned some of the other players, Randy Moss. These, probably had a mood disorder, probably had anger problems, probably was ADD. ADD can cause some significant impulsivity, significant anger issues, flying off the handle, not knowing how to cope with, the vicissitudes of life. I mean, these young men have seen things that, they're more privileged your counterparts have not seen and faced. So yeah, they come with trauma. So the university should be prepared for that. Should have crisis management ready for when these young men, and I say mostly young men because I don't want to be exclude the women, but we're dealing mostly with the high revenue grossing sports at Division I schools, football and basketball, men's football and men's basketball. And there's a few outlier schools that have more than one revenue producing sport, like Utah. They got football, basketball, and gymnastics. Right? They have 3 streams of cheese coming in. So, which is great when you have a world class, D1 college gymnastics team. So, but at any rate, so I'm speaking mostly about young men of color, young African American men of color, and what they go through. So, yeah, crisis management should be available, which is why I find the BYU situation so incredulous, man. Well, they have the means, they know what they're supposed to do. At least rhetorically, they know.
So you're saying they should be more pastoral in their
absolutely. And I argued that in the last chapter. Here's an opportunity to really, really change, and they've done that they've done it through osmosis. And I say that in the sense, I'm not saying that young men have to convert to Mormonism, but there have been some young men who have converted to Mormonism since they were here. I can think of a hand.
Ty Detmer.
I'm thinking Kalen Hall. I'm thinking black players in particular. Who else? Jamal Willis, him. There's several of them. And when I look at them and look at where they are, they're doing extremely well, man. So I don't know if that's the church or if it's the chicken or the egg, but they do great. So why not harness that same energy with non-Mormon players?
Right. No, I think that's great.
Another thing. And this BYU, if you're listening to me, please hear me on this one. You have the Marriott School of Business here, one of the best business schools in the country. Why not have a career day for these athletes? The ones that may not finish their degree. Maybe you get them or may not go to the league. May not go to the league. They need a job. Why not use your resources at the Marriott School to imbue these young men with a potential job? I mean, the church is well-connected business in terms of its business connections. So much more can be done for these young men who need that kind of help.
And let's talk about the graduation rate at BYU. One of the things that caught me off guard was the BYU had the worst graduation for black athletes in all of the NCAAs. And Utah and Utah State, 2 schools just up north, were, I believe, with the national average. Yeah. So, what is it that BYU can do better to help more black athletes, especially, or just black students in general, graduate?
I think you said it well, more of a pastoral role. I think you said it. I think, they have to shepherd these young people. But white people can't do that by themselves. They have to have people who look like these young men to do that.
So recruiting people like France Davis or somebody like that,
Mormons, maybe. Other members of the church, non-Mormons, who fit in with the culture here, who want to be here, individuals like that, or grow your own, and they've been doing that. They've been growing their own. Why not bring Kalen Hall back? Why not bring Jamal? I know Jamal's working there. I think he used to work there, at least in the athletic department. He was working as an advisor. So that's a good thing. Jamal has not always been Mormon, so we can still remember when he wasn't Mormon. Right. So he might be able to help and bridge some gaps there. So if you can't bring him in or recruit him in, then grow him. We have fantastic resources in church who are black that are former athletes. I personally know who would be, dynamite if they would do it, So there's resources there. So the church should or BYU should take more of a pastoral role. I think that's a fantastic, and work in collaboration with the Marriott School. Use your resources, use your connections, show that you care. You can improve this. Because, the lowest in the state, I was surprised to see that. Very surprised to see that. And it's see what I'm saying? Rick, so the data, all of that data, plus the GSR scores, plus the story is becoming clearer. Then when you ask the athletes, well, what did they tell you when you came here? What did they tell you? Well, they sort of velvet glove I heard that so many times, man. So after a while, you say, well, damn, that must be, that really must happen to these guys. They keep saying it. I keep hearing it independently from different people saying they kind of velvet gloved it. Well, they didn't really say the real story. We didn't really know that it was going to be, swift, harsh discipline. We didn't know that. Had we known that, we maybe would have thought differently about coming there. So they kind of velvet gloved that, and so that was deceitful and deceptive. And so, like the former coach, or the coach who is connected with both schools said, we brought the kids' families in. We showed them the city. We showed them what their kids would be doing. We really tried to make them a part of this experience, right? And we had better results. They don't do that here.
Mm-hmm.
They can learn a lesson from their neighbors to the north.
Well, let's turn to college sports in general. And I wanted to get your opinion on whether you thought one idea was better than another. There's been a lot. I know yesterday you spoke about the attempt to unionize college athletes, and so there's one question: should we pay players, and should they even be students? If we're gonna pick, the Randy Mosses and the Mixons and the Johnny Manziels who really have no business being in college, why don't we just pay them as an employee? So that's one option. On the other hand, you have the rule from the NFL and the NBA. The NBA says you've got to go to college, or you have to be 19. It doesn't say you have to go to college. But between 18 and 19, you have all these one and dones. Joel Embiid and a lot of players that are just in college. And a lot of people say, well, that's ruining college basketball, this one and done. Although John Calipari seems to have it down to a science there at Kentucky. The NBA says you have to be your junior year of college. So would it be better to eliminate these restrictions? And of course, the colleges don't make these restrictions. This is the NFL and the NBA. So that we just say, you know what, you can jump straight from college to pro if you're good enough. Mm-hmm. Or should we start paying athletes? Do you have a preference as to one opinion's better than the other? Or
I'm thinking. I am a fan of pay for play. I mean, for the reasons that you just mentioned. I mean, I think for the reasons you just suggested, the elephant in the room, these men, less than 2% of them will actually go to the league when they graduate, if they even graduate, depending on where they go and all that. So we know the numbers. We know what the numbers tell us. So, let's pay them. Let's treat them like the employees that they are. I mean, and I don't mean that to be, I'm not being facetious and trying to be funny. I'm serious about this. I mean, if you look at college athletics, it's a business model. They need workers. These players are workers. If they graduate, great, fantastic. But if they don't, great, let's get the next chunk, So it's a business, and business has to have employees. And so let's pay them. I'm all for that. I'm all for unionization. Why not? By the time a football player is 20 years old, right, they're already having signs of CTE.
Well, that brings up another thing. CTE, I was going to mention that. So you've got some people from a troubled background getting hit in the head, and I believe CTE can have a propensity for violence as well.
Yeah, it can. It can produce symptoms of anxiety, depression, some of the things we typically see in folks who have mental illnesses. So we see that. Anger issues, defiant issues, lapse of memory, sleeping problems, nightmares, flashbacks, even some very post-traumatic stress-related symptoms as well. So, football is a violent sport, and that's why we tend to venerate people who don't fit the typical profile of a football player who comes out of the hood, who comes out of urban, someone like Tom Brady, for instance, right? The good all-American boy, who could have done anything but chose to play football, right? And have this kind of success that he's had in his career. It's not like that with blacks. It's different with blacks. Blacks are the workhorse of these professional leagues. They're the workhorse of the Division I bowl series, football bowl series, and the NCAA tournament. They are the workhorse, and they get nothing for it. And in fact, what's interesting is when UNC won that game was a really good game. They played Kentucky the other night.
Yeah, last week.
One of the players said, "We just made the university a buttload." I'm paraphrasing, a buttload of money, and he was not kidding. I mean, I did not know that 50% of the salaries that the commissioners make in the NCAA are paid out by this tournament. So that's critical. The tournament is critical to their salaries. It's top. They're fused. It's a business. Let's treat these young men like the employees that they are. If they want to get a degree, that should be a part of their contract.
Yeah. So would it be good to just separate the student from the athlete and just say, we're hiring you because you can play football.
Yes.
And we don't care if you go to school.
Yes. And I say that simply because we're already, I mentioned this the other day, maybe I didn't in this context, but universities are struggling right now to become more and more corporatized, right? As they get corporate money. And of course, it's the influence that the corporate America's dollars brings to these institutions to transform them into institutions that produce more workers, more future workers, et cetera. So as long as corporate America continues to bastardize the higher educational system, why not pay these young men, treat them like the workers they are? Why not? Let's.
You'd lose a lot of NCAA scandals in the process.
Absolutely.
Reggie Bush.
Right. Let's quit faking the funk. Let's be honest and real about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean,
even Johnny Manziel, the Ohio State tattoo scandal, which was a silly scandal, if you ask me.
It wouldn't matter. Because I think what this is a student, this is a, there's something about a student that we sort of, this is a student and why should they be doing that? And these are employees, these are workers, these are athletes.
Many of them are flat out, the only reason I'm in school is because I'm trying to make it the NBA. I believe it was, who was the number one pick in the NBA last year? Ben Simmons. I heard that after the tournament ended, he never went to class again. He only went to LSU specifically because he couldn't go to the NBA. And he was the number one pick.
Well, I have a young man in my class right now who was a prospect, NFL prospect. And he was in the paper last week, and he just said he was going to stay out. He was going to not go to declare and go into the draft this year. He's going to wait a year. And so I had him come to class, and he's in my class, and I said, well, tell us why you decided to do this, why you decided to make this move. He goes, because if I wait a year, I'll be a higher pick, and I'll get more money. So he said nothing about education, nothing about wanting to be stay and get his schooling, because it doesn't matter to him. His brother's trying to help his family.
So would it be a good idea for the NBA and the NFL to just get rid of these rules, basically forcing kids to go to college?
Yes. Some people don't need to go to college. Let's just say that. Some people don't need to go to college. I mean, don't shoot the messenger, y'all. I'm just telling you what the system that y'all created is doing to people like me, people who look like me. So, this is on y'all's watch. So, no, not everybody needs to go to college. I mean, blacks have been branded as athletes. That's what they do. They've been conditioned to be athletes. So they haven't been conditioned to be doctors and lawyers and engineers. They don't see widespread representation of black doctors and lawyers and professionals in the community where they come from, or even on TV, or maybe they don't even know a black professional. So that's the only thing they aspire to, because that's what we should continue. The image we continually show of black men is the image of the athlete, the thug, the criminal, the gangster, the this, the that, the other. Never the humanist, never the philosopher, never the mathematician, never the lover, none of that. It's always in negative ways, sadly.
All right, so let's turn a little bit. One of the things you mentioned in your book was Jeremy Lin. Now, for some people may not understand who Jeremy Lin is. He's an Asian American. I don't know if he's Chinese or Japanese or whatever. But anyway, he went to Harvard. He went to one of the big schools. Jeremy saw a different kind of racism than a black athlete. And the other thing,
thought that was interesting.
It was very interesting. But I don't know how many people have seen the movie Linsanity. It was at the Sundance Film Festival. Documentary, which talked about how he became a star. But I didn't realize that Jeremy is a person of faith. And it's really brought out in that documentary. But contrast that with Tim Tebow, a white player who's very good, who, they talk about Tebowing, he's always kneeling, he's very Christian. And so it's funny to me, talk about how racism's involved with Jeremy Lin as opposed to Tim Tebow, how they're both men of faith, but only Tim Tebow gets branded as the good Christian, and Jeremy, well, he's just this amazing athlete. Right. And he shouldn't be an athlete because he's Asian. He's not black. Right. He's one of those smart Asians. Talk about that.
You bet. Well, it's the typical stereotypes around Asian bodies. I mean, we aren't conditioned to see Asians as basketball players. We see Asians as mathematicians, scientists. We see them as quiet, meek, humble, some of those qualities that we ascribe to people. We see Asians as being allies. We see Asians as being safe, model minorities, right? So certainly someone like Jeremy Lin, who's actually Southeast Asian, this guy wouldn't be the phenomena that he was for that brief run that he had in a couple years ago. He had this brief run, but he's continued to do that though. But we don't see that anymore because at the time that it was going on, it was a perfect set of events that took place that gave him that catapulted Jeremy Lin to the stardom that he had. So at any rate, so we're not conditioned to see the Asian as being a basketball player, but people may not know Jeremy Lin was actually a great basketball player out of California. He did great in California, but not one scholarship offer, not one came his way.
Wasn't he Mr. Basketball?
He was Mr. I mean, no one even looked at him, so when he actually got his shot, for that brief run he had with who was the team he was playing for, the Knicks, that brief run with the Knicks, the players who knew him knew he could play already. They already knew he could play like that. It's the world that didn't know that. The world didn't know. So people were riveted by seeing a man play that wasn't supposed to play like he played. They were riveted by that. So we focused on his exoticness, his Asianness. And you say you want to juxtapose that to Tim Tebow. Tim Tebow is the perfect Christian. He's a white male, right? He's wealthy and he's handsome. He's a college graduate. He's an athlete, and he's got all of the things that embodies what a football player, at least from a Southern perspective, should be. So in the South, the image of Tim Tebow personifies football, even though football is dominated by black players. But when you have a player like Tim Tebow, it's almost like when Jack Johnson fought in the very famous fight he fought with Jeff Jeffries back in the 1800s. This buildup of this, the Great White Hope with Jeff Jeffries versus, the animalistic beast of Jack Johnson. Same kind of a thing with Tebow. In terms of Tebow's, what he means to Christians, white evangelical Christians, particularly when he was in Denver. Denver was a whole interesting story about Tim Tebow. So Tebow can pull it off, or Tebow is celebrated for his Christianity. And someone like Jeremy Lin, who is also deeply Christian, I would even argue probably more Christian than Tebow because he's so humble about it. He doesn't parade it around. But we weren't interested in that. With that aspect of his identity, Lin's identity, but Tebow's identity, it just fit his identity because that's the narrative that we typically hear about, at least in the South, of what a football player should be. Someone like Tim Tebow. So Tim Tebow's character, his character really does personify football. It really does personify what the ideal level of football player should be. Someone like him, someone who's all the attributes that I mentioned before. So looking at those two men, it couldn't be weirder between those two during that brief little. We had some really interesting things happen in sports over the last few years, and these are two of the most interesting aspects of sports that I sort of honed in on and saw as really interesting and sort of telling the story about why black players are continually marginalized, even at schools that shouldn't marginalize them, like religious institutions, I would argue. I mean, not that they should be any different, but they are. They have different in the sense that they're doing the same thing that white schools are doing, but they should because they have a religious mission that governs their ethos. And why won't they follow it? And I argue that because the church has never really followed and really atoned for its racist past. This has a lot to do with that, I believe. The fact of the matter that the church, like other institutions, by its actions, its treatment of blacks, not just members of the church, but also athletes, tells us a story too, that we don't value you much. We don't, your success is not, as an institution, although there's individuals within the church who are not like that I know personally who are not like that. But institutionally, it sends a message to black players, non-Mormons, and black members that we don't really value you much. We don't really value your opinion. We don't value your bodies much, other than in this particular domain. You value my body, but not my brain, So I hope we can, I don't know, maybe we can do better.
Yeah. One other thing, maybe an element of a little bit of a hypocrisy I wanted to bring up. We have a current college player, Grayson Allen, for University of North Carolina, he's a white player, I'll preface it with that, has tripped at least 3 other players on the opposing team. The most recent time, Duke, and he plays for Duke, who we just said had a great graduation rate. So Mike Krzyzewski, the coach, said he was suspended indefinitely the last time this happened, just a few months ago. That indefinite suspension lasted 1 game, which a lot of people said, come on, that's kind of ridiculous. Let's compare and contrast that a little bit with Brandon Davies. And maybe Brandon Davies had an issue. Maybe it was an off-court incident versus an on-court incident. Do you think that has anything to do? Davies was banished for the rest of the year. It was an indefinite suspension, but although he did come back, can you compare and contrast those? I know in your book you mentioned how Jim Rome lauded BYU to say, look, they have this honor code. I may not agree with it, but hey, they stuck to their guns. Props to BYU for doing so. Whereas Mike Krzyzewski said, winning's more important. I need Grayson Allen on the court. Talk about those 2 situations.
Well, they're different. I think for the reasons that you just mentioned. I think Coach K is trying to win basketball games. He's not interested in sort of the moral underpinnings of decisions like with the BYU thing. But he's trying to win ball games, man. That's his focus. He's got a lot of enormous pressure on him to win. And so even though he's deified there, now he's a deity there. I don't know if you guys know, Coach K is a deity. So he floats around campus. They see him floating around campus everywhere he goes. So, but anyway, so I think that's so. But whereas also Grayson is a white guy, a white kid, right? So we don't generally associate white kids with the type of negativity that we mentioned earlier about the black body, black men are thugs, blah, 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 all the things I said earlier. We don't associate, even though his behavior is abhorrent, right? Tripping and carrying on, but that's a different set of circumstances because he's a white kid. Whereas Brandon's flaw, and what Brandon did is tap into, I mentioned this yesterday in the talk, one of Mormonism's deepest, most thorny topics, and that's interracial marriage, right? Interracial relationships is truly a vexing conversation around in Mormonism. And what I say in my book is I say that I even say it's the crux of the issues that blacks have had on that campus. It's because of relationships with white women. That's been the driving force behind all of this. When you look at all of these expulsions, the majority of them have to do with sex. There's a couple of drugs and rock and roll thrown in there, but mostly sex, right? So, and let me say this about the sex part, real quick. The white women here in Provo are coming after the black men. It's not the other way around. Don't get it twisted. They're coming after the black men. They've never been with black men before. They like black men. They find them interesting, exotic, or whatever they want, whatever. It's the new flavor of the month. And so their curiosity gets the better of them. So sex and race and sports converge as well. And it's interesting, when I was speaking to, I forgot the other kid's name. He was off the chain when he was here, Ronnie Jenkins, when Ronnie was here playing. I said, Ronnie, when you first got to BYU, tell me about the sex thing. We don't talk much. I want to know the nitty gritty stuff. This is porn for me, man. No, I'm just kidding. What I was saying is, he was telling me, I said, well, before I started winning, nobody knew who, nobody looked my way, man. I was another, but when I started scoring, the first time I started scoring touchdown, I couldn't fight them off. He said, I could not fight these women off. I said, seriously? Oh, man, it was free for all. These are like Mormon girls? Yes, Mormon. And I heard that so many times. So winning sort of, sexually aroused the young women that were, in his vicinity or enough to seek him out. And these were members of the church, right? These are young Mormon girls who are extremely interested in these young men. So most of the incidences stem around sex. Think about it. Think about Harold B. Lee's comment to, the president, Ernest L. Wilkinson. Remember his, if my daughter marries one of those, one of them, I'm gonna hold you responsible. I mean, that's just not a statement, isolated statement. That cuts at the core of Mormonism, right? The debate over the main issue being interracial sex and dating and marriage, like the story about some of the Black Pete things you were telling me about. It's really what this was about, man. And we see the modern incarnation of it play out in football. So, I mean, I wasn't an athlete, but I was a student at BYU and up at Rick's College. I can tell you, it was a free for all. Them young girls up there, and I wasn't a player, but I may as well have been. I was treated like one. I mean, even now, people tell me I'm a player. They say, oh, they don't know who I am. They'll say, oh, yeah, you a player? I mean, students will ask me, I'm a player. I mean, it goes with being black and male, tall, wide, black and male. You're a player. You obviously played before, and sadly, most have. So,
couple last questions. So, as far as Jim Rome praising BYU for suspending Brandon Davies for the rest of the year, did you agree with Jim Rome's statement, or talk about that?
I don't think Jim Rome understands the context. I don't think he understands. He's just looking at an incident, an isolated incident. He doesn't understand the deeper meaning behind it. So it was spoken out of context. It was spoken foolishly, without understanding what was the particulars behind this. I mean, Brandon was treated differently than most players in that he wasn't kicked off entirely like other players who were non-Mormon were. He got that courtesy extended to him. But the way he was paraded around and made the scapegoat, and I know that had an effect on him, to be the whipping boy for, because there's already a stigma around Black people and sex. So now he's the poster boy for, sexual, inappropriate sexual relations as a Mormon. So I know he was carrying that stigma. I spoke to the young woman who was the girl who he got pregnant. There was a young woman that he got pregnant that was attending UVU, and she gave birth to his child. And Brandon signed over his parental rights. So the child was adopted by a member of her ward in California. So I think she still has access to the child. The young woman has since gotten married to someone else and I think she's having her family. And Brandon, I think, played for he played up north somewhere, for some basketball team up north, NBA for a very short time. And he left there and went overseas. I think that's where he is right now. That's a tortured dude, man. He's a tortured. He reminds me a lot of, his experiences would be very akin to Colin Kaepernick, right? Not having ever been around Black people before, then boom, he's just all of a sudden around. And to see him struggle with that identity, those identity clashes, I'd love to be a fly on the wall, with him. So,
since you mentioned sex, I want to bring up two other issues, and I don't know how familiar you are. This past summer, I believe it was, there was a big issue with rape at BYU. And so there's a lot of issues about the honor code, talking to the police, and basically girls who were reporting rape being then subject to an honor code investigation and basically smeared in the mud. And they said, look, we've got to separate those two. So can you talk about how do you think BYU could handle that better?
Allegations to rape is always confidential, and it's a confidential issue. So first of all, why are we even knowing about it? Why do we even have to even know about any of that? That's none of our business. I mean, in terms of the public's business, that's between the young woman, whoever the perpetrator is, in the institution.
Well, I think BYU would be more than happy to keep that away from the media. Yeah, it's been the women who brought this up to our attention and said, look, I was subject to an honor code violation and I didn't do anything wrong.
Well, from that standpoint, and that's an outrage. I mean, if the honor code is punishing the young women for something that they had no control over, had nothing to do with, that's horrible. And it speaks to what we've said about the athletes. You're having people make subjective decisions, right, about other people based upon their own lens, their own way of seeing the world, which may not congeal with a young woman who's complained or who has alleged rape.
So let me just point out, I remember reading an incident where a woman went to her bishop and it claimed that she was raped. Now, I don't know that law enforcement got involved, but her bishop's response was, well, I hope you don't get pregnant because I'll have to pull your ecclesiastical endorsement. And she's like, I was raped. Could the church do a better job of training bishops to avoid this kind of
mishap?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably so. I mean, yeah, probably so. I would have thought would have done that by now. That would have been a part of what a bishop goes through to be trained to be a bishop. In the manuals and the handbooks that talk about what the bishop's responsibility, that should be right up there. They should be having workshops. They should be having meetings around these kinds of, because the church has been embroiled in stuff like this a lot over the last several years about rogue bishops and rogue church leaders going off and doing their thing, and then of course making the church look bad. So but at the end of the day, it's the church's responsibility if these individuals are working under their stewardship. If they're working under an official capacity as a leader, a lay leader, they need to be trained, on how to deal with these sorts of very important issues that young women bring to the fore. Now, that when those young players in 2012, 2004 or whatever were alleged, there was a white college students at BYU who alleged that these had been raped by these kids, these young players. And when it came right down to it, they hadn't been raped. She had made it up, right? And so these guys went through it, man, until, I don't know if you heard about the trial that went on down here and these young woman who raped, or alleged rape. But anyway, a long story short, she was playing off racial fears that are so deeply ingrained around, again, Black sexuality. But praise God, at the end of the day, the truth came out. And what's funny about that is that the one kid, I can't remember his name, I think I write about him. I don't think he's in this particular book, but I can't remember the kid's name. He graduates. I think he leaves BYU, but he's exonerated. And the other kid took a plea deal. Don't know what happened with him. But the follow-up story of that kid is he ended up in jail in Texas. He's on death row in Texas for murder. This young who went here.
Really?
Yeah, I tried to reach out to him, talk to him.
I'm not familiar with that story.
I was going to go down to Texas and go see him in the prison. I wanted to see what circumstances, because all this went south for him when he left here. When he was kicked out of here, and his life just took a turn for the worse. So, and I met a couple of players like that, actually, who their lives, and they, when I talked to them about when I was interviewing these kids and they're not kids now, these former players, you could still hear the pain in their voices over years ago. One in particular, Ronnie, was even more striking when I spoke to Ronnie about this. You could hear
Ronnie Jenkins?
Yeah, Ronnie Jenkins. You could hear the pain in his voice and how he felt he'd been deeply wronged by, what had happened here, despite the fact that, they gave him a couple of chances. So he said, the way it went down at the end was, he just felt, you could just hear his pain, and not just him, but other players as well. So this stuff really matters to me. When I spoke to one of the Polynesian players about this, who actually plays in the NFL,
Harvey Longy?
I believe it was Harvey. Yeah, I spoke to Harvey's brother about his and I also spoke to Harvey about it. The pain, man, and he's a member of the church. The pain that they carry around with this is deep. It's like a heavy weight on them. Even the non-Mormon players, and some of them were very scared, afraid to talk to me. They were afraid. After all these years, they were like, dude, I don't want the church. They're afraid the church is going to come back and do something to them. I'm not kidding you. It's almost like a paranoia. I'm like, dude, this was 10 years ago. They ain't thinking about you, man. But they were concerned that history would come back and resurface again and make their life difficult the way it did. So a lot of trauma around it. So again, I want to underscore, these are kids. These are 18-year-olds, man. What do they know? They just graduated from high school. We throw them into this system. We expect them to, and they're already unprepared. We expect them to comply. You're here now. Do what Mormons do. It doesn't work like that. And we ought to know better than that.
So let's turn to another kind of recent topic here. So BYU has been trying to, they're right now independent in football, West Coast Conference, trying to get into the Big 12 conference specifically, which on the one hand seems like a little bit of a good fit. You've got Baylor, Texas Christian. There's a few schools there.
And you play on Sunday.
Yeah, so that's a big issue. Although it seems like from the news reports that I've been getting, it sounds like the University of Texas has this big deal with ESPN, and BYU has a big deal with ESPN, and it sounded like the Big 12 thought that the combination of the Longhorn Network and BYU TV could have been a media match made in heaven. However, it seems like what scuttled the deal was the issue about gay athletes. And so I know that Iowa State, who's in the Big 12, and a few other schools had some students protest against adding BYU, and that's really what scuttled the deal because the Big 12 also, the combination of that and ESPN and Fox objected because it would have hurt them financially.
Objected to
BYU joining the Big 12 because there was an issue in the contract that said if the Big 12 expanded, then ESPN and Fox had to outlay a whole lot more money, and they were already paying BYU with their own contract, so they would have essentially been paying BYU twice. And so, but it seems like the real issue, I think it's the combination of ESPN and Fox didn't want that to happen, at least until BYU's contract is over. And there's a question of whether the Big 12 is even going to survive past the next 8 years or something. But it seems like those protests at Iowa State, and I believe it was Missouri, had a big impact and basically scuttled that deal. So my question to you is, what do you think about this issue? I mean, I don't expect the church to change their position on gays, but there's a lot of gay athletes at these other Big 12 schools. You've also got the rape issue at Baylor, which was another black guy. But anyway, so can you comment on that situation? What do you think about BYU in the Big 12?
I think would up their athletic competition immensely to be able to play better teams for sure. BYU can compete. That's just I don't want to mince words. They can compete. I mean, they got some of the best Mormon talent you can find anywhere that competes at a high level. So they need to move up into a different level, but that means we're back now. We'll go back to the recruiting issues. We're back to, those things. But then also Pandora's box with gay athletes. I don't know. That's a very interesting. I didn't know that. I haven't been following that, but that's interesting to me. I want to go back and look at that. I want to find out what's going on with this. There's something there, and there's a story in there. It reminds me a lot of the stuff I was writing about with black athletes. I don't know. I don't think BYU will. Why would they care about gay athletes? Why would they care? Why would
other big schools care? Big 12 schools are concerned that their gay athletes are going to come to BYU and
be mistreated.
I
got you. I can't see that. I don't see that happening. I think that they have enough sense to know that the world is watching them when it pertains to this kind of a thing. So I think that's I understand and I'm sympathetic to what the plight of the gay athlete is at these Big 12 conferences, but I think it's a little bit overstated paranoia, right?
Well, let's talk about that because yesterday at UVU there was a conference on race that you spoke at, and right before you got there, we watched a movie called The Black 14 about Wyoming. A lot of people were going to see a lot of parallels between the black athlete of 1969 and the gay athlete of 2017. And so can you talk a little bit about, number one, what are the Black 14 of Wyoming? And let's talk a little bit about some of those other protests against BYU about their specifically policy about blacks. And, does that relate to the current gay issue that we have today?
Well, I mean, it does and it doesn't. It relates in terms of oppression, right? So oppressing people who are marginalized is bad, period. So it relates that way. But in terms of, the history of marginalization from 400 years of, working in the fields to being denied opportunities and jobs and this and that and the other and being terrorized by the Klan. And no, gay athletes don't have that. They don't have that same history. They just don't have it. Because I don't know if you're gay. If you walk around and foreground your gayness in stereotypical ways that I've been conditioned to believe and know as a consumer of media, then yes, that's one way you can broadcast your gayness. If you walk around as an ordinary person looking like what an ordinary person looks like without any identifying markers of you being gay, I wouldn't know unless you told me. So it's not the same history. It's a different history. I want to be clear about that. Gay rights is not civil rights. It's not. It's a different trajectory and a different history. So let's not conflate the two. What they share in common is oppression. That's what they share in common. But the histories of marginalization and oppression are very, very different. I'm not anti-gay. I'm not saying that to be anti-gay. I'm just saying to be correct about the degree of suffering here, right? We have a suffering card. It's a very big suffering card. I realize gay and lesbian folks have a suffering card, and transgendered people and queers and other folks have a suffering card too, right? But y'all's suffering card gets enveloped in race. I mean, if you want, in other words, someone who's black and gay feels the stigma of being black and gay 3 times more than a white person who's gay, simply because of the way the narrative, the way blacks have been positioned and constructed in society. So I want to be clear on that. That's why I want to go off on a tangent. I want to be clear. This is gospel tangent, but I want to be clear when I say that about it. Not to say that I'm anti-gay. I don't want no hate mail from your listeners about me being anti-gay. I'm very supportive of gay folks, but I want to be clear about the degree of oppression we're talking about here. There's a difference there. So back to the question that you were asking me earlier.
So let's talk about the Black 14 first.
Black 14 were 14 young black men who in the 60s, like most predominantly white institutions, were starting to recruit black players. The WAC was recruiting black players in the 60s, mid to late 60s. So Wyoming had its largest group of black players, just like BYU did in 2004 or 2003. Largest group of black players come there. And during the 60s, it was a very difficult time in our nation's history with civil unrest. You've got the war going on. You've got civil rights. You've got women's rights. You've got all these different movements underway, right, during the late 60s. So blacks are wanting to assert themselves and they want to protest or BYU's position on blacks via the Mormon Church. So they're coming after BYU via the Mormon Church's position on blacks. BYU's a target. And all they want to do is wear armbands, which essentially signifies the fact that they, recognize the church as racist, and they want to show people that the church is racist by wearing these armbands. They say 14 on it. Well, the university had a cow. They had a cow largely because of Lord Eden, the coach, who was the coach at the time. Lord Eden, when he had heard wind or got wind of it before it even was announced, by the way, before they even showed up to the gym, he had inklings that this was going to come. This was coming, right? So he was prepared. So when they came to him, he already knew what he was going to say. So it was that overwhelming, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to be political. Participation is not welcomed. And you also see this very same image of we're back to politics and sports, right? When politics and sports conflate, this is a great example of it right here, and how sports how professional sports and college sports, at least early on, have been pushing athletes or pushing these issues from entering into the competitive playing arena, football or the gridiron, or basketball or like football. So these young men merely wanted to raise awareness to the treatment of the Mormon Church's position on blacks, and they sought to protest it with their bodies, and they caught hell for it. So I was struck by the 14 of them. At the end of the documentary, you can see the names of the individuals. I was in the documentary, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
People realize that. So I was very fortunate to be asked to do that. But this what happened to these guys. After this, the lives where they went. Many of them didn't finish, go on and play football. A lot of them. 2 of them, I think, dropped off the face of the earth. They can't even find them. 2 of them just disappeared. One of them died. Several of them are older. There's even tension between the 14. The way that one player, I can't remember his name, the lighter skinned player, the guy who came back the following year and finished his degree, got his name. There was tension with him and Mel Hamilton. Mel was the brother with the beard. I spoke to Mel Hamilton on the phone when I was doing the book. And you may find this very interesting for your listeners. Mel Hamilton's son is Mormon. He joined the church. I don't know if you knew that.
I did know that, actually.
That's
But
very
yes,
interesting.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, a very interesting turn of events there. You know, when Mel told me that, I was like, "Are you serious?" He goes, "Yes." I said, "Wow." I mean, tell me about that. I mean, and he said, "Well, it was shocking to me." I was like, but now I'm okay with it.
I have to say, Mel actually spoke at BYU a couple of years
He did?
ago. Yes, yeah.
A couple years ago?
Yeah, Margaret Young invited him to speak and talk about the Black 14. And so
With his son, right?
he did mention his son had joined the church, so that's how I knew that. But one of the things that he said was that he felt, even as a non-Mormon Black man, that he played a role in the 1978 revelation.
Oh, I have no doubt.
And so my question to you is, there were other protests besides this one in Wyoming. Let's talk about San Jose and Stanford and some of those other things.
Right.
Are you tell us about those?
And I think the immediate effect of the Black 14 decimated the Wyoming program. That point is clear. They still haven't recovered from that incident. That was years ago. That wasn't the biggest thing though that really got the ball rolling. Is when schools started to cancel their games against BYU. Now you're talking money. Now you're talking millions of dollars going down the drain for not competing. And when you got the WAC coming after the WAC, saying, the WAC is telling BYU officials, "Can't you do something? Can't y'all just please something? Just y'all making the conference look bad. Can't you do?" And remember, BYU helped to set up the WAC. BYU is responsible for the WAC even being in existence. So they got, what? No, we're not going to, no. So you got this tension going back and forth between administrators at BYU and the WAC, who is embarrassed by the attention that they're receiving from the Wyoming 14, right? Bad press means low ticket sales, right? Means no contract or very little airtime. And that this is a business, as we talked about before. So they want to keep the business model rolling. The biggest blow came to BYU, not from the WAC, because I think they had some inroads with the WAC, but from Stanford. That was probably the biggest blow when Stanford said, "We're not going to play y'all. We're done. Stop. If your God is racist, then we're not gonna. We don't want to be I'm paraphrasing. We don't want to be any parts of that." That really hurt BYU. Major school like Stanford backing out of competition was huge. That's enormous.
Now, I want to ask you a question about that. Back in, was 1970 or so? Was it approximately?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Late 60s, early 70s. The mascot for Stanford was the Indians.
Yeah. Isn't that?
Now, the Native American tribes said, "We don't like the fact that you're using Indians as your mascot." And so in 1972, they changed, actually, they just said, "We're just Stanford." And now they're the cardinal, the color, not the bird. They are just a color now, the Stanford Cardinal. Does it seem hypocritical of Stanford accusing BYU of racism?
Very hypocritical. Very hypocritical. But it goes to show you where our level of thinking around these issues of race and indifference were during that time frame. The focus was on African Americans, right? That was the focus. Pull the beam out of your own eye before you turn the gaze on others. They didn't see that as a problem. Maybe they had permission from the tribe to use.
No, they didn't. That's why they're not the Indians anymore.
That's even worse.
Yes.
So yes, that's enormously hypocritical. But isn't society riddled with hypocrisy all over the place, sadly.
And since we mentioned Indians, we've got the Washington Redskins, the Cleveland Indians, and the Atlanta Braves. What's your opinion on those? Are those racist mascots? Let's go with even the Dallas Cowboys. Is that racist?
No, I don't think the Cowboys are racist. I don't think that means no. If you're caricaturing Native Americans for profit, it's racist. If you're using their image to make money, their likeness to make money, it's racist. Simply because of the history of Native Americans and white people in this country. It's not been a seamless history. So much of the same racisms that destroyed Black communities are the same ones that destroyed Native American communities and banishing them to reservations and then exploiting their image, right, without their permission.
So you would support, the Washington Redskins getting a new name. I guess I should note that the school just north of here, the Utah Utes, actually, they do have permission from the Utah tribe, so the Ute tribe, and the Illini of Illinois, I believe they have permission, as well as the Seminoles of Florida State. So, um, I guess if it has permission, then you're okay with
Still
that.
racist.
It's still racist.
It's still racist. I call it commodity racism, right? Racism with a twist. I mean, yes, because you're still tapping into the same stereotypical ideas about whether you have their permission or not. You're still reinforcing a cosmology of racial indifference, or that these people are, set up for this type of endeavor, right? To be the fodder of entertainment. So, yeah.
So that brings up another point. I want to talk to you about racism. And you mentioned this yesterday in your talk. A lot of people think that racism means I'm hostile to a group, and so by that standard, a lot of white people are not.
They bristle at the notion.
They bristle, yes. And I've had some conversation with people who bristled at that. But talk about what racism is. That you can be a nice racist.
Yes, I have a nice bumper sticker that says that. Utah, the nicest racist you'll ever find. It says it on this little bumper. It's really kind of cool. Yes, I mean, I think the lay public tend to think that racism is about individual acts of meanness, aggression, one race against another. Like I hate you, Rick, you cracker. I hate you, Darren, you nigger, right? So that's what they think racism is. That's that's interpersonal racism. And that's where it stops for most people. They don't go beyond that. We're talking about institutionalized racism. We're talking about practices, patterns, behaviors, beliefs that get imbued into an institutional standard or norm. And people are racist by practice, racist by default, or racist by privilege, right? In the sense that whites in this country benefit from racism because racism allows whites more privilege because of their skin complexion. Being white means you have more privilege in this country because you don't have to deal with driving while black. You have to deal with being kicked out of BYU because, you had sex with some girl who wanted to have sex with you, consensual sex with you, or you don't follow the honor code, or whatever the issue, whatever the stereotypical notions that follow around people are. They don't have to, white people don't have to worry about that. They don't have to worry about that. That's something that whites take for granted in a racist society. So blacks and other groups who are marginalized have to constantly deal with that on some level, whereas whites don't. So that's the difference. And so most white Americans look at race as an interpersonal phenomenon, and it stops there. And what I'm saying, and what I think you were saying, and at least you alluded to in your question, is that it's deeper than that. It's much more, it's amorphous, yet it's superfluous. It's everywhere. We engage in it all the time. But we don't even know about it. We're unconscious of it much of the time until it's brought to our. Now, you might be more conscious of it, Rick, because you engage in behavior that puts you in direct direct contact with these discussions. You know what I'm saying? So other white people don't do that. You're like an exception that way because you actually put yourself in the margins doing these interviews with people like me and others who have, differing views about life and the world and so on. That's a good thing. We need more of that to unlearn the racism that speak us that we're unaware of. So yeah, I'm not talking about, and I want to be clear to your audience. I mean, that interpersonal racism excuses and lets off the hook the prison industrial complex. Why black and brown men and increasingly more women are relegated to our prisons. 2.5 million prisoners in this country, the most anywhere in the world, right here in this country. And much of them are black and brown bodies who only make up, as you are a statistician, you understand the numbers. How can 13% commit 90% of the crimes? How's that possible? I mean, blacks are disproportionately locked up in prison to their numbers. We're only 13% in the country, yet we make up 65% of the prison population. How is that possible? Unless blacks are being targeted, or they're being watched more, followed more, arrested more. So it doesn't. So you and I hating each other, Rick, doesn't explain that. We got to look at those things and at a much deeper level. And we don't do that enough in this country, because I understand that racism is a very uncomfortable topic for most whites. Try living in a black body. Try that for a change, right? You have the privilege of talking about it and going back to your life. I have the privilege of living in my skin after I leave here and dealing with this interview, right? The aftermath of this interview. That's something more than just an interview. but having to relive some of these old racial traumas that I've had to deal with over the years of my life. Just being Black in a country that doesn't value me as a Black man. I get sick of talking about this stuff. I told you that yesterday. I really do. I get sick of talking about it. But I know I have to. I know it's important that I continue forward, but I would rather talk about something else.
So I don't want to keep you too long. I've kept you a long time, but let's just finish this with, because I'm sure that most of my listeners are going to be white.
I'm certain of that.
What do you think? What are some things that you would recommend for white people to deal better with racism and to get over these problems with the prison industrial complex and the Washington Redskins and whatever, the travel ban or whatever?
Okay, well, I said this yesterday. All humans have a negativity bias, right? It's old. It's 25,000 years old. It's a long time, right? Our ancestors used that to live, to survive to the next generation. That's still here with us today. Whites have a negativity bias that's been racially primed, right? Around Black people, very strongly around Black. There's a very strong visceral reaction that whites have to Black people. They do. It's been studied, it's been looked at, and it's a reaction that's neurological too. You can actually measure it in the brain. You can actually see where these areas in the brain light up when whites are having to deal with Black people on any level, which is really interesting. It says a lot about how deeply ingrained this stuff is. Whites have to, I think, as a group, have to look in the mirror first and say, well, ask yourself a question. These are white people of goodwill out there. What am I doing to contribute to any of this at all? Am I doing something that's contributing? Am I to blame for any of this stuff? Is it my fault that any of this? The question to that, or the answer to that is no. You're no more at fault for racism being born in a white body than I am being born in the Black body, in the circumstances of our birth and the circumstances of our racial, programming and mapping and so on. It is what it is. But the burden of responsibility is on white people, because the greater responsibility has fallen on whites to govern, to run the country, to do this, to do that, to all of the stuff that white people have created, and whether it be discourse, philosophy, movies, whatever it is, right? Whites have to recognize that much of the racism that continues to go to divide Americans is not being caused by people like me. I don't have the power to do that. I don't have the resources to do that. I don't have the means to do that. I get every now and then someone like Rick will interview me, and I may or may not have effectuate a change. It takes a long time to change ideas. Someone told me this last night, Rick. It caught me off guard, but I thought about that for a moment. He said, it takes 1,000 years to produce somebody like you.
Like you.
I'm like me? Think about all the Black people in this country. They're in this country. How many were doing what you do? I said, I don't know. He goes, not a lot. I would argue not a lot. It takes a long time to produce someone to think about deep things and to have the courage to speak about those things without any regard for safety or those kinds of issues. And I was like, wow, I didn't really think about it like that. But whether it's true or not is another story. But it's a compelling thought in and of itself. I don't hate white people. I want to be clear about it. I don't hate white people. People say, oh, you hate white people because No, I don't hate white. That's a stupid question. That's dumb. I don't hate white people. Some of my best friends are white. I'll use that. I'll use that saying, right? Which is true. It happens to be true. It really does happen to be true. I hate white supremacy with a passion. And I hate the fact that whites are ignorant of it. I hate that. But I don't hate individual white people. I don't know you, Rick. How can I hate somebody I don't know? Personally, no. Now, I do know whiteness. I know what existentially whiteness means. I know that. But in terms of your likes and your habits and what the things I don't know that. But we probably have a lot more in common than we do across race than we ever do divided by race. But we never take the opportunity to get to know each other very, very often. And when we do, it's often in stereotypical ways, or it's talking about things like this, because these things matter to us. It matters. Race matters. Sports matters. Subject positions and statuses matter in capitalism. It matters. So you say, what do we do to end it? That's a huge question. A huge, another discussion point. We have to end inequality in America. It's unsustainable. Economic inequality in this country is destroying us in a number of ways. It's destroying us phenomenologically, existentially, as people, as humans. We can't relate to one another. It divides us. We're arguing about the wrong things, man. We're talking about the wrong things. And that's our biggest downfall. To end inequality in America, to end oppression, means we have to start asking different questions. Different questions of our leaders, different questions of people that we vote for, different questions of the type of people we want to be, the type of nation and society we want. America is still an experiment. Remember that. We have not been around thousands of years like some of our European counterparts. We're only a couple hundred years into our experiment. We're still working this shit out. Everybody in this country came here, particularly Europeans, to exploit this place. This was an outpost, a British outpost to be exploited, much like Australia, much like India. America, there was no worth in America other than her ability to be exploited, right? So of course, those that were here saw it differently. And that's a whole nother story. We have so much potential to be great, but not in the way that Donald Trump is portraying greatness. I'm not talking about that. But to be great means you have to end the itness. The ites have to go away. And one way we do that, and I mentioned this last night, we have to change how we think about this stuff. One way we do it, and I said this last night again, white Americans have to learn to cultivate empathy, particularly for Black people, because they don't have any. As a group, whites don't have empathy. So the Good Samaritan rule only applies to whites. So whites are more apt to help other white people, less apt to help other people, especially Blacks. Blacks are more apt to help other people, as well as other Blacks. Other groups are more apt to help other people, right, as well as their own group. Whites are the only group that has no love for maybe Asians, maybe a sprinkle of Asians, but whites routinely do white, hang out with white, look and vibe white. That has to change. Most white Americans in this country, not all white Americans, but most white Americans, I would argue, lack empathy for people of color. That's why it's easy to pull a gun and fire and kill a Black man without any really real remorse. That's why when you see pre-incident polling between whites and Blacks after a shooting, you get such different answers about, Blacks see it as abhorrent. Whites say, oh man, he should have stayed still. They don't see this guy's a human. They don't. Janan talked about it today in the meeting. She says that, and I was trying to get to that yesterday, when Darren Wilson shot and killed
Michael Brown,
he said in the statement, he looked like a demon, right? So Blacks have a long history of being, caricatured, objectified like that, demonized like that. I mean, so if you don't see people as human, it's easy to cast them off. Until that changes in white America, we're going to continue to be talking about this. But in the short run, mindfulness. To me, that's the antidote for white America. For all Americans, and especially white Americans, mindfulness. So it's a 2,000-year-old practice, Buddhist tradition practice, where you learn to cultivate. It's called insight. Learning how to focus on or pay attention to, right, your breath, right, so that in between our thoughts, yesterday's, regrets, tomorrow's what ifs. There's that little juncture of peace within that moment. We spend too much time worrying about tomorrow and yesterday and not enough time worrying about today. There's something special about worrying about today. Worrying about today enables our brains. This is a really interesting area of study. For me, as a scholar, as a scholar, my work has taken me full circle to this moment right now. I'm convinced that white Americans can change through mindfulness, through cultivating mindfulness. I mean, I believe that deeply. I've seen it happen. And I believe white people, racism has affected white people too, in the sense that whites have lack of empathy for people of color. This is why it's hard talking about this stuff. Because I care. So let me stop for a second.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you. We'll just stop there, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. And
It's okay, man.
really appreciate it.
It's so emotional talking about this.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.